This weekend podcast that we're not doing this week.
Jesus doesn't think you're a freak, or if he does, he thinks you're a freak in a good way.
Trust me, you two, I know what normal talk is.
Go big or go home. It's a saying we've all heard, and it seems like that's become the working slogan for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Universe at stake? That's nothing. I mean, there's a whole multiverse out there to explore and battle through. And with each batch of Marvel movies, we're getting what gamers call power creep. Heroes and villains with more and more potency, often paired with stories that have more and more spiritual angles to consider. Hey everyone, Adam Holz here, your host of the Plugged In Show, focused on the family's weekly conversation about entertainment, pop culture, and technology. Thanks for joining us today. Well, think back with me, if you will, to the first Iron Man movie. I know it was a long time ago, way back in 2008. Robert Downey Jr., I think coming into it, we thought was a little bit of a gamble, but man, he was a revelation. This was a role that everybody will now associate with him pretty much forever. The movie really got good reviews, and it seemed like comic book movies had begun a new chapter of exploration in terms of what could be done with this entire genre. And of course, if you had a big enough budget and enough computers running, CGI processors to help you out. But the story itself, well, it was actually pretty limited. I mean, it was a guy in a suit fighting an arms deal and bad guys in that sort of realm. But now we've got stories that threaten every living creature in existence. That is where we're at these days with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Consequences that stretch across the cosmos. So today we are going to talk about that and how Marvel has gradually shifted from, I'll call them Earthling-sized stories to cosmic ones with gods and goddesses battling to shape all of reality. With no further ado, let's dive in. Today I have with us Emily Clark, Kennedy Unthank, and Paul Asay. Hey everyone.
Hello.
So we're going to be talking about Avatar a little bit later. I figured I should ask, what's your favorite James Cameron movie and why? Go. Paul, I can tell by your expression that you were eager to launch us off with an opinion that just begs to be argued with. What do you think?
Yeah. So I tend to think that James Cameron went downhill after The Abyss. The Abyss, it's a very, very old movie.
He's been underwater since then?
Yeah, so
quite literally in some.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So it's essentially this underwater tale, super, sci-fi, all this great kind of stuff. Ed Harris was in it, which is one of the reasons why I really like it.
Ed Harris makes everything better.
He really does. The other thing is I was watching it with a bunch of college friends, and there's a really intense scene where water's filling up in this submarine type thing, and the water's getting higher and higher and higher, and you don't know what's going to happen. The movie actually cut out right during that scene. Just as things were starting to get really serious, we had to wait for 20 minutes for that scene to restart.
It's like a rain delay.
It was really kind of crazy. But I still remember just the echoes of, in the room when it just went out. So that's one of the reasons why I do like that movie.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he just likes to have breaks in his movies, because there was an intermission in my favorite movie by him, which is Titanic. And I'm going to say Titanic just simply because greatest love ballad of all time. So, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
All right. Titanic.
I'll
Kennedy?
go for the nostalgia factor.
All right.
I remember when I was really little watching Avatar. And, I was ignorant.
You were really little?
Yeah, really little.
He was a wee babe.
I can't even remember if I was double digits at that point.
Man. And yet here you are, all grown up, and we're glad you're here with us.
Well, I remember, and, I was too young to understand all the hidden messages under there, but like a lot of the really cool shots, the floating islands, the being able to transfer your conscience into this avatar.
Tall blue person.
Yeah.
I'm glad somebody enjoyed that movie, because I thought it was overhyped.
Yeah, no, I mean, nowadays when I see the story, I'm like, it's not that good.
Yeah.
But, in my head, it was this perfect little world of, wow, you can like do whatever you want here. So for me, it's just the nostalgia factor.
So it worked for you.
As a kid, yeah.
As a kid, yeah. All right. Well, I am hard pressed to pick just one. I mean, there are several I think I have to go with Aliens from 1986.
Aliens.
I mean,
Yeah.
it took everything that was fantastic about Alien and like turned it up, but not in a way that wrecked the original. And the progression of special effects from 1979 when Alien came out to 1986 was significant. And if you have ever watched Alien and wondered, why don't we see the alien very often? It's because their special effects budget was so small that they didn't have enough money to have him on screen very much. So there you go. What
It
you
works
don't
out.
see is scarier than what you do see.
Blair Witch.
Blair Witch, right? Another podcast for another time. All right. So now that we have our favorite James Cameron movies on the table, let's talk about Marvel. Let's talk about what's going on there. And we're going to be talking about power creep. And Kennedy, you recently wrote a blog on this called What is Power Creep in Marvel and Why Does It Matter? And that's sort of our catalyst for our conversation today. So to get us started, tell us a little bit about the core argument or idea that you're making in your blog.
Yeah, so really I analyze it through 3 different subcategories, I guess. And the first is that, just in general, power creep tends to, it's not necessarily always a bad thing, but it tends to make a lot of the characters that you have grown to know and love, it makes them very irrelevant because, they can't really play with the big boys anymore. They're get booted to the JV World Saving Squad.
And that's when there's power creep with the villains, right? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
heroes and
heroes too,
villains.
yeah.
Or
Because,
heroes, okay.
you have someone like Doctor Strange come in who can literally turn time.
All of a sudden,
And,
Daredevil.
it doesn't really...
Yeah.
I mean, Hawkeye's ability to shoot arrows relatively accurately doesn't really hold up.
It's not a
Relatively
superpower.
accurately.
But the more important ones, though, obviously, as you keep getting these higher and higher stakes, especially with the multiverse, I was talking about, well, what do you do with this? Because when this universe is destroyed, does it really matter when there are infinite other ones that you could just, if you just cut the movie suddenly and switch to that universe, well, would we even know? Because there's infinite other possibilities.
Right.
So losing one doesn't really seem as valuable anymore. And then finally, obviously, we get into that really spiritual stuff. We've seen multiple deities of various religions introduced. Many of them, they kind of conflict with each other if it weren't for Marvel's meddling and saying like, oh, actually, we're not even going to talk about the fact that there's these Egyptian gods out here at the same time that there's these giant celestials.
Okay.
And who knows which creation story is the right one in Marvel, but yeah.
It does feel like you need a flow chart, like
really
one of
do.
those hierarchical flow charts to see who answers to who sometimes.
Well,
when you're
that's my
talking about
my
this.
thing, because I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, did the Celestials also create the Egyptian gods, or did the Egyptian gods create the Celestials, or
And what about the Mesoamerican gods that we
Exactly.
get in Black Panther, Wakanda Forever? We have yet another entire pantheon, and we have Zeus and Hercules and the Greeks. And what other gods and goddesses have we seen so far? 'Cause-
It's really
Thor
complex.
and the Norse gods.
well, Thor and the Norse gods. See, I knew that there was somebody we were missing.
But
Yeah.
even with Thor, they originally explained it as they're not actually gods; they're just like a super advanced civilization just out in the cosmos, and humans mistook them for gods because they're so super advanced. But now they're kind of switching it, and they're kind of being like, well, actually,
Yeah.
they're kind of gods.
And then you've got the time variance authority, which seems to be over a lot of this sort of stuff, where all of a sudden these infinity stones, you even mentioned this in your blog, the infinity stones are just these paperweights. So it becomes,
we're just playing marbles with them.
it really becomes very complex.
So why do you think, I said in the intro, we started with Tony Stark and Iron Man and his armor and fairly sort of concrete abilities. Here's a smart, rich dude who's got cool weapons. I mean, he's kind of Batman on steroids, I don't want to offend
No,
your sensibilities, Paul, but
He's an inferior form of Batman.
he's an inferior form of Batman. I will let that ride for now. Why do you think we have gotten to this point with Marvel stories? And I think that I want to talk about that from a storytelling perspective, but I also want to begin to get into some of the spiritual questions that we've hinted at here, because I think that's where the significant conversation is for our families.
Yeah, so I think on one hand, it is kind of a natural thing for a series or a show or something that's been going on for such a long time, power creep, I think, just naturally kind of happens. You see it in a lot of other shows, when you see like The Walking Dead, they'll have someone who's more powerful have to come in and fight the survivors. You see it in Breaking Bad, where he starts off with just having to deal with a really low-level grunt, and then he ends with having to fight the whole cartel pretty much. But,
Everybody in New Mexico.
Well, the shows that come to my mind are Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Supernatural. And I think it's in Buffy where they actually, whoever the big bad character they're facing, that's what they call it within the show itself. They're like, okay, we're just prepping for the next big bad. And it's true. It's like at the end of any show where there's that kind of action and adventure story kind of happening, as seasons go on, you start running out of your big bads. You're like, okay, what's worse than Satan? Oh, I know. God has a sister and she's the darkness. Like, that's Supernatural that I'm referencing right now. And then we're like, wait, we defeated the darkness. You know what? God's gonna be bad now. Like, they brought in the Antichrist, they brought in everything, and the final big bad wound up being God himself. And it was like, okay, you guys ran out of ideas a long time ago,
And that becomes really problematic, right? When you're always looking for these more and more powerful bad guys, because that's the end game in some ways. You're dealing with a lot of things that are very, very important to people who are watching.
Well, yeah, I mean, if bringing it back to Marvel too, we're even past what they've called the end game.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's the post-end game.
We have all these moments, though. I think what essentially Marvel has found themselves is they're kind of pigeonholed, where they have said, okay, well, we have a bunch of superheroes who are smart enough to be like, okay, well, maybe we should prep for the next battle. Right. And, they prep for the next battle. And when you prep for the next battle, well, you can't really bring someone on who's the exact same power level, so now they have to go higher. But they've reached a point where we can't really go any higher without getting into this spiritual, metaphysical world.
And for me, I think that one of the things that these always increased takes is actually draws me out as a viewer, as a person who's watched a ton of these movies. I think that I resonate so much more when it feels like the stories are more down to earth, when it feels like they're more relatable. When it starts to get into the multiverse, it just sort of, again, just as a viewer, it loses me a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, and, in the early Avengers days, you had Iron Man, Hawkeye, and Black Widow, none of whom actually has superpowers. They're just average people who are really talented at what they do.
Also really good looking. I just want to say that.
That's part of the
Okay.
superpower.
Moving on from that strange sidebar. No, but you had these average people who were just really talented at what they did. You could relate to them because there was no magical component. There was no spiritual component. It was just, nope, these are just people who Iron Man was just really smart and a really good inventor. Hawkeye got really good at shooting his arrows. Black Widow was a trained assassin, and, you would always pit them up against these people who did have superpowers. You had Loki and all the aliens and everything in the first Avengers movies, but you could it was kind of unreasonable to pit, Hawkeye and Black Widow against them, I always thought, because they were average, but they were just strong enough and just good enough at what they did that they could, battle those guys. But then when you put Black Widow and Hawkeye against Thanos,
right.
It was like, oh, well, yeah, they're not going to stand a chance. Like, why are they even here anymore?
Well, there's a reason why Hawkeye wasn't even in the movie.
I know. They just keep bringing in, but that's why, they keep bringing in new guys, because they're like, okay, if we're going to up the if our heroes just barely won this battle against our big bad, and we bring in an even bigger bad, then we need to have even bigger heroes. And then you have to ask the question, well, you were sitting here all along, Captain Marvel. Why didn't you come and help people at some point? And it's like, oh, no, she was off, doing her own thing in the cosmos. But, yeah.
Just to switch like superhero universes for a minute, I think that this is one of the things that explains the popularity of Batman, right? Because he is just to take it
I
back
see
to
what you
Batman.
did there,
But
and
Brings
I'll
it
allow
back
it.
to
But go
Batman.
ahead.
But when you think about it, people resonate with Batman because he's a little more relatable. When you look at Superman, he's so powerful. He needs such a big bad guy to deal with things. In our modern age, he's not quite as popular as this average dude with a lot of money and a very cool car.
Right, and a cave.
And a cave. And I think that when we look at sort of these superhero universes broadly, one of the appeals is not the superpowers, but the heroism. We know that superpowers do not make the hero. It's what they decide to do with the opportunities that they've been given, right? It is all about doing the right thing when it needs to be done, even if it's hard. When you see somebody who is a little more realistic, a little more relatable, I think that resonates with us because we all have those times in our lives where we have to make tough decisions to do the right thing.
And that's when those stories work, is what I hear you saying.
Right.
And I think we saw that in Spider-Man No Way Home. I think, you have this huge cosmic thing happening with villains coming in from different universes because of, Doctor Strange's spell going awry. But my favorite part of the movie is, are these villains going to choose to be evil when they can choose to be good? I mean, this sort of really core question of character. I think too, as I think about it, I have so many thoughts. I feel like we could probably do this discussion for the next 3 hours. It's almost impossible to talk about superpowers without talking about the second half of that phrase, power. It's you're getting into a godlike realm, right? You're dealing with omnipotence and who has enough power to overcome the evil that faces us. And so I think it almost without fail has to go in a spiritual direction because the stakes keep getting bigger and bigger. So I'd love to just talk about where the spiritual intersects this power conversation a little bit.
Yeah, so, Marvel's had really no secret that they've been going in the spiritual direction for a while. I mean, when you bring in the Norse gods, they started off by saying that they were essentially super advanced aliens. Even Scarlet Witch, they said, well, originally she was essentially just experimented on with, this, with one of the Infinity Stones, but still, it was more based in a more grounded level.
Almost scientific in some ways.
But as we've gotten further and further and further, and as they've realized, we've just introduced someone who they defeated who had the ability to snap half of existence out of the world, and with literally, like I said, just a snap of a finger. How much higher can you go than that?
Right.
And so you see them start to add all these other gods. We've seen canonically now, you've seen, ancient Aztec gods. You've seen plenty of gods in Thor: Love and Thunder. They even made a reference to Jesus, which Watiti said was intentional. And then you also have, someone like Kang the Conqueror, who is supposedly supposed to be the next big bad villain of Phase 5. And at one point in Loki, he says, hey, if you kill me, I'm just going to come back again. And eventually, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Loki, he does die. And he says, I'm coming back again. And lo and behold, in the Ant-Man trailer for Quantumania, we see Kang is back. And it's just something where we start to think, well, what are the repercussions on this, just philosophically, spiritually?
I think that was one of the things that actually made the new Black Panther movie, Wakanda Forever, powerful, was the idea that in the superhero universe, so often death is a temporary thing. It's just a little tiny setback.
Yep.
In this movie, it was much more powerful because it was much more permanent. We know that the actor who played Black Panther had died, and he was not coming back. And I think that because of that power, when we realize that the stakes are real, it can become much more resonant with the viewers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when you have characters who just constantly come back to life, you actually lose a little something there because it's like there are no stakes. Like this, if the stakes are life and death, which is literally the highest stakes can be, but actually, if you die, you can come back to life, then there are no stakes.
Well, and I think it gets at, again, all kinds of spiritual questions, right? Because I think in our existence, and maybe this is one of the ways that we talk about it with our kids, you're not coming back from death from some magical means or chronological means or all of the ways they essentially cheat death. That's a final thing, and that's why the gospel is important.
Yeah, and I think something else to touch on really quickly is that in the times when death is more of a permanent in Marvel, specifically with the spiritual side of everything, Marvel's kind of taken the stance of everything is valid, all of your beliefs are valid, and when you die, you're going to go to whatever afterlife you had believed in.
Right.
So because they've shown that the Black Panther afterlife is valid, the Egyptian afterlife is valid, Valhalla exists. They've shown all these places exist, and that's something we just need to warn our kids about. Is that no, this is not true.
Yeah, as we go into this more spiritual time frame for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I know that lots of kids, lots of teens, lots of families go to watch these movies. But it's really important as parents to be aware of the direction that Marvel has turned, and you have to be willing to take on those difficult conversations. The spirituality, in some cases, for some families, can be navigable. You can even draw some interesting parallels with our own faith. But for a lot of times, it may be where you just say, this is something that's off limits, or this is something we are going to set aside a time to talk deeply about, to talk about some of the spiritual issues that we see here.
I love that, Paul, because what we're saying is, as we respond to it as parents, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, even necessarily within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I remember being really bothered by the spiritual darkness in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And I remember not having the same sort of emotion with Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, which is, again, positing an entirely new pantheon of belief with these Aztec gods and goddesses that relate to Namor, who people may know as the Submariner. And so I think that we do have to enter into it with that kind of intentionality. Are there things that are going to be out of bounds? But if we're going to watch it, what are the connecting points to our faith? And I think that we can talk about this issue of power. I mean, that's one of our core struggles as human beings, right? We want to be able to affect change. Well, I think a lot of times we're on the other end of it in that we're not superheroes. We're normal, And so I think part of the fantasy of superheroes is, wouldn't it be great to have the power to be able to resist or to change the things that we can't impact, as normal mortal human beings. But obviously that's where our faith comes into play. What does it mean for me to trust God with the things that I can't change or can't impact? And so I think depending on the movie, depending on your family, there could be conversational jumping off points there to talk about those things. Or you say, you know what? That is just way too dark, and there's not enough redemption here to justify even wading into it. If you've listened to the Plugged In show for a while, you know that I'm a huge Vision and Scarlet Witch fan because they were my favorite heroes as a kid. But I don't really like what they're doing with some of the dark spirituality of Scarlet Witch's story. And so with all of these heroes, if we have favorite heroes or favorite stories, we've got to make the call. What's good? What's bad? Where's the line? But we want to engage with those stories intentionally so that we're helping our kids see, here's the real connection point to our faith and what we believe, because ultimately these are fanciful and fun stories, but we have the ultimate story that we trust in.